When something is developed for the first time, its design typically reflects the technology advancements or limitations of the time. As time goes on, through a process of rethinking, trial and error, we find improvements that benefit even more people. Improvements that make a thing we've created not only better, but that also make it more useful for us all.
A man in a motorized wheelchair enters a restaurant and moves up to the counter.
To create a province where every person who lives or visits can participate makes good sense for our people, our businesses, and our communities. That's why we're making Ontario accessible to all. How do we do that? We do that by striving to remove barriers. Barriers to accessibility are obstacles that make it difficult, sometimes impossible, for people with disabilities to do the things most of us take for granted. Barriers aren't just physical things, such as steps into a bus or a door without a push-button opener. Information that a person can't easily access or understand can be a barrier. For example, when the print is too small on a brochure for someone with vision loss to read it. Technology, or lack of it, can prevent access. Even everyday information technology, like telephones and computers, can present barriers. Organizational barriers occur when policies, practices, or procedures don't take accessibility into account. Attitudinal barriers are about what we think or assume. For example, assuming someone with a speech impairment can't understand you. Removing barriers doesn't have to be complicated. Mostly, it takes a slight shift in perspective. Approximately 1.85 million people in Ontario have a disability. That's 15.5% of Ontario's population. As the population ages, it's expected that the number of Ontarians with a disability will increase, as will the need for accessibility. In 2005, the Government of Ontario passed the Accessibility for Ontarians with Disabilities Act, also known as the AODA. Its goal is to make Ontario accessible by 2025 by creating and enforcing accessibility standards. These standards are rules that businesses and organizations in Ontario have to follow to identify, remove, and prevent barriers, so that people with disabilities will have more opportunities to participate in everyday life. Standards address key areas of daily living, such as customer service, information and communications, and employment. Several accessibility standards are contained in one regulation under the AODA. It's called the Integrated Accessibility Standards Regulation, also known as the IASR, or simply the regulation. The IASR also includes a section of general requirements that apply to all the standards in the regulation. This regulation is now law, and requirements are being phased in over time to meet the goal of an accessible Ontario by 2025. This gives organizations time to make accessibility a part of their daily business. It's important to note that the standards do not replace requirements established under the Ontario Human Rights Code to accommodate persons with disabilities to the point of undue hardship. They also do not limit obligations under any other legislation. If two laws conflict with one another, the AODA states that the law that provides the higher level of accessibility is the law that must be followed. Compliance deadlines for the requirements vary based on the size and type of an organization. So it's important to know how the regulation defines different types of organizations. The regulation applies to every person or organization that provides goods, services, or facilities to the public or other third parties, and that has at least one employee in Ontario. Organizations are grouped into 5 classes. The Government of Ontario, including every ministry, the Office of the Premier, and the Legislative Assembly, including constituency offices of the members of the Assembly. Large designated public sector organizations with 50 or more employees, including municipalities, hospitals, school boards, colleges and universities, and public transportation organizations. Small designated public sector organizations are those with fewer than 50 employees, such as the Ontario Office of the Fairness Commissioner and some municipalities. Large organizations are those with 50 or more employees in Ontario. This includes private sector organizations such as businesses and not-for-profit organizations. And small organizations are those with 1 to 49 employees in Ontario. In this module, you will learn about the general requirements. This section of the regulation outlines the requirements for accessibility policies, accessibility plans, training for employees and others, procurement processes, and self-service kiosks. Accessibility improvements benefit us all. Accessible buses and exterior paths of travel are not only good for people who use wheelchairs or canes, but help people carrying luggage and parents with strollers. Closed captioning allows both people with hearing loss and a group of friends at a pub to understand what's happening in the game. Accessible documents and websites not only make using a screen reader possible, but also work better on personal handheld devices. Greater accessibility means greater opportunity for Ontario. If we become more inclusive, we really will create a province where every person who lives or visits can participate and contribute to the life of our communities. Doing so makes good sense for our people, our businesses, and our communities. For all of us. Consider for a moment what you've done so far today. Perhaps you browsed a newspaper on the internet or checked your email. Maybe you attended a meeting or had a casual conversation with a colleague in the hall or through instant messaging. So much of our world today is about information and communications, from chatting with your son or daughter to reaching out to colleagues. But imagine what it would be like if all those lines of communication suddenly became blocked. If, when surfing the internet, some pages just don't work. When you open up a document that you were told contains information you need, such as a bus schedule, it's unreadable. Or what if, while in a meeting, suddenly, it's as if the sound is turned off? If your access to information was turned off, how would you know what's going on in the world around you? How would you make decisions? It would be like entering a world where everything appears to be the same, but rather than finding information that will allow you to participate, you find barriers. Always another barrier. The good news is there are solutions to information and communication barriers. For example, technology. For people without disabilities, technology makes things convenient. For people with disabilities, technology makes things possible, as long as they're set up right. For example, if you're following web development best practices, your website may only need a few tweaks to be accessible to those with disabilities. In addition, some accessible solutions can be as simple as reading a document out loud to someone, or providing an electronic version so they can resize the text to suit their needs. Making information and communications accessible is not only helpful to people with disabilities, it benefits us all. A properly formatted document or accessible website displays properly in all browsers, including personal handheld devices. The Information and Communication Standard, as covered in this module, outlines how organizations will be required to create, provide, and receive information and communications in ways that are accessible to people with disabilities. When it comes to the workplace, it's little things that can create barriers for people with disabilities. Barriers can be in processes, in a tool we use in our work like a computer, an aspect of the physical environment, or attitudes. Listen to this story about a job ad that wasn't accessible.
I found one. It sounded just perfect in terms of my qualifications. The position was for a disability counselor. But when I tried to access the rest of the information about the job, my screen reader couldn't read it. The website was not accessible. So I called to ask for more information. The difficulty I'm having is that I can't access the information on your website with my screen reader. So is there someone who can spend a few minutes with me going over some of the information? I'd like to apply for the job.
There's a lot of information here. I don't have the time right now to give you everything. But if you give me your name and number, we'll be sure to have someone give you a call back.
Unfortunately, no one called back. And because the website wasn't accessible, I wasn't able to even apply for the position. The next time I applied for a job, I was fortunate because I found an employer who made sure that their website was accessible. And I was able to read the whole thing, including the history of the organization. I did apply for that job, and finally, I was able to get an interview.
With an ad that wasn't accessible, the first organization missed out on reaching a good candidate. But you know, Making an accessible document isn't all that difficult. In this next clip, a project manager talks about how simple physical accommodations at the office made all the difference.
I work in project management for a training company. For me, the first day on the job was a challenging part, but nothing we couldn't work out. The desk I was given wasn't designed to fit a wheelchair. Plus, all the reference documents the information design team used were placed on a shelf too high for me to reach. A different desk and moving the books made everything work fine for me.
According to Statistics Canada, Ontarians with disabilities are more likely to be unemployed or underemployed. By making your recruitment processes and employment policies more accessible, you open your doors to a much larger resource pool. It's a win-win situation. So how do you open your doors? It's all about looking at your human resource processes through an additional lens. Some of you may be familiar with the Employment Standards Act. It sets out the minimum fairness standards for the workplace. The employment standard, under the Integrated Accessibility Standards Regulation, is different. It deals with accessibility in the employment cycle. It builds on the obligations that employers have under the Ontario Human Rights Code. The standard formalizes workplace accessibility processes that many organizations already have in place. And accommodating specific accessibility needs due to disability doesn't usually take as much effort as you might think. The majority of people with a disability require no accommodations at all. A recent study found that when accommodations are required, employers reported that 56% of accommodations cost absolutely nothing to make, while the rest typically cost only $500 or less. For such a small cost, the rewards are immeasurable for your organization, for your new and existing employees, for the bottom line of your business. The employment standard, as outlined in this module, addresses the processes and procedures organizations follow in recruiting and accommodating their employees. The standard will help people with disabilities participate in our labor force and economy, and will help employers find untapped talent.